Welcome to the deep dive. Now, if you're like most people, you probably have this picture of Neanderthal extinction, right? The sort of symbol battle, clever Homo sapiens, us, versus the slow, dim-witted brute.
Yeah, that classic image.
Well, get ready for a major rethink. Because that whole narrative, it's basically extinct itself.
It really is. Science has moved way past that simple competition hypothesis. The idea that we just outsmarted them or outfought them.
So what's the new thinking?
The consensus now is really shifting, quite dramatically actually, towards what you'd call a demographic explanation. It's more of a quiet, complex biological fade-out.
A fade-out, not a takeover.
Exactly. Driven not so much by, spears and violence, but by tiny, almost invisible cumulative differences, biological differences.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. We've gone through the sources, and it seems the story is about these incredibly subtle biological factors. We're talking single genes, differences in how cells divide, even ancient environmental toxins.
That's right. Things that just slowly, subtly stacked the evolutionary odds against the Neanderthals over thousands and thousands of years.
A war of genetics, not spears.
You could put it that way, yeah. A quiet biological extinction.
All right, so before we dive into those molecular details, we really need to set the stage properly. We have to give Neanderthals their due, because the old idea of them being simple savages, well, archaeology has just blown that apart, hasn't it?
Oh, completely. The evidence piling up now shows their cognitive sophistication was, frankly, pretty much on par with contemporary Homo sapiens. They weren't just making tools.
You were thinking, planning.
Absolutely. Demonstrating symbolic thought, complex social planning. It's quite clear now.
What are some of the really striking examples, the ones that make archaeologists go, wow?
Well, there's La Roche-Cotard in France. They found these abstract lines and dots traced with fingers on the cave walls.
Scratches?
No, clearly intentional. Dated to about 75,000 years ago. These are the oldest known engravings in Europe. It suggests abstract expression.
Okay. And burials?
Yes, intentional burials. Not just, bodies dumped in a pit, but evidence suggesting care, maybe even ritual. Symbolic acts.
But the one that always gets me is the engineering feat. Brunicle Cave. Tell us about that.
Brunicle. It's incredible. Deep inside this cave in France, they found these structures, rings built from deliberately broken stalactites.
Built, like constructed.
Yes. They snapped off hundreds of stalactites, carried them, arranged them in these complex circular patterns. This required planning, coordination, probably lighting, deep in a cave.
And when was this?
Get this.
Yeah.
176,000 years ago. That's way before we thought anyone was doing something that organized and symbolic.
Okay, so they're clearly intelligent, capable of complex symbolic behavior, which brings us right to the big paradox. If they were so smart, and we know modern non-Africans have, 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA.
Right, the genetic evidence for interbreeding is undeniable.
So why do we still talk about them as a separate species? Why didn't they just merge into the human population?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's where things get freaky. That interbreeding definitely challenges the old, strict biological species concept. The textbook idea that different species can't have fertile offspring.
But they obviously did, at least sometimes.
They did, but experts still lean towards classifying them separately. And the reason comes down to long-term, consistent anatomical differences, things that stay distinct for hundreds of thousands of years.
Right. So even with some mixing, the core populations kept their distinct features. What were the key differences anatomically?
For Homo sapiens, us, it's really two defining traits. That high, rounded brain case scientists call it a globular skull shape and a relatively narrow pelvis.
And Neanderthals?
Consistently different. They had a longer, lower skull, think more like a football shape compared to our soccer ball shape, and a distinctively wider pelvis.
So these physical specializations, maintained over vast time scales, suggest two separate long-term evolutionary paths.
That's the argument, yeah. Even if those paths crossed and the boundaries were, let's say, permeable for a while.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about that permeability, that hybridization. Because while mixing between closely related species happens quite a bit in nature, you see it in wolves, bears, lots of birds.
Yeah, it's not totally unusual.
Not at all. But for Neanderthals interacting with the incoming modern humans, this hybridization seems to have been a real double-edged sword.
And a big part of the problem, according to the sources, wasn't necessarily incompatibility in the sense of, broken genes, but more about population dynamics, this idea of mutation load.
Exactly. That's a critical piece of context.
Yeah.
You have to picture the Neanderthal populations. They were generally smaller, more isolated, spread thin across Ice Age Europe and Asia.
Like scattered villages.
Yeah, a good analogy.
Yeah.
Scattered villages compared to the modern humans coming out of Africa, who represented a much larger, more interconnected, and rapidly growing population like a booming megacity.
Okay, so smaller population size means.
It means natural selection isn't quite as efficient. In small, isolated groups, slightly harmful genetic mutations, little typos in the DNA that aren't immediately fatal, but just subtly drag down fitness they tend to accumulate, they don't get weeded out as effectively as they would in a huge population.
So Neanderthals were carrying, on average, a heavier backpack of these slightly dodgy genes, this mutation load.
Precisely. So when a Neanderthal and a Homo sapiens had a child, that hybrid offspring inherited not just a mix of traits, but also a dose of that higher Neanderthal mutational load.
Making them maybe just a tiny bit less healthy or less fertile.
On average, yes.
Yeah.
Marginally less fit compared to a pure modern human child at the time. That's the sort of baseline disadvantage we're talking about.
Okay, so that's one subtle pressure. But the sources point to something much more specific, a kind of biological landmine in the genome, this piezo-1 gene.
Ah, yes. Piezo-1. This is fascinating and potentially devastating. It seems to be a really specific genetic incompatibility that acted as a kind of reproductive trap.
A reproductive trap.
Okay, so Piezo-1 is involved in red blood cells and how they handle oxygen. The Neanderthal version of this gene seems to have made their red blood cells bind oxygen more tightly.
Which sounds like a good thing in the Ice Age, right? Cold, maybe lower oxygen levels at altitude.
Exactly. It was likely an adaptation,
Yeah.
helping them extract and hold onto oxygen efficiently in challenging conditions. A survival advantage for them.
But there's always a but.
The but comes during pregnancy, specifically in hybrid pairings. Here's the crucial part. If the mother carried the Neanderthal Piezo-1 allele with its super oxygen-binding blood, and the fetus she was carrying had the modern human alleles for that gene, the mother's blood basically held onto the oxygen too well. It didn't release enough oxygen across the placenta to the developing fetus.
Oh, wow. So the fetus was essentially being starved of oxygen.
That seems to be the implication, leading to a significantly higher risk of miscarriage, stillbirth, or perhaps babies born with health issues due to oxygen deprivation. Fetal oxygen starvation.
So, a Neanderthal woman carrying a hybrid baby fathered by a modern human man would have faced this higher reproductive failure rate.
That's the model, yes. This specific maternal-fetal incompatibility would have just steadily, relentlessly chipped away at the success rate of those hybrid lines, specifically when the mother was Neanderthal.
And you mentioned this solves a long-standing puzzle.
It potentially explains a really big one. We all inherit mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, only from our mothers, right? It's passed down the maternal line.
Right.
Despite all the evidence of interbreeding, modern humans today have absolutely zero Neanderthal mtDNA. None has survived.
I never thought about that.
This Piezo-1 reproductive trap, which specifically disadvantages pregnancies where the mother has the Neanderthal allele, provides a really powerful mechanism for why those Neanderthal maternal lineages were systematically lost over time. They simply had lower reproductive success generation after generation.
Okay, so Neanderthal lines are struggling with this mutation load, and this specific piezo-1 trap is making things worse, especially for their maternal lines. Meanwhile, what's happening on the Homo sapiens side? Were we just lucky, or were there positive advantages evolving in our lineage?
Well, it looks like there were definitely things changing on our side, too. Researchers have drilled down into the genome and identified hundreds of genetic changes that are common in modern humans, but rare or absent in Neanderthals and other archaic humans.
How many are we talking about?
The specific study identified 647 of these high-frequency human-specific changes affecting 571 different genes. It's like a molecular fingerprint of what makes us us.
And where do these changes cluster? What kind of functions do they affect?
A lot of them are involved in really fundamental processes, neurodevelopment, brain function, naturally. But interestingly, quite a few pop up in genes related to the cell cycle, how cells divide and organize themselves.
Cell division, why would that be so important for differentiating species?
Think about development, how an organism builds itself from a single cell. Subtle tweaks to the timing or mechanics of cell division, especially in the brain, can have big downstream effects on the final structure.
So changes in genes, like I see KSC5 and SPAGA5 mentioned here, related to spindle poles in dividing cells.
Exactly. Those kinds of genes. Modifications there might have influenced the specific trajectory of Homo sapiens brain growth, especially that unique globularization phase, when our brain case got that characteristic high, rounded shape, different from the longer Neanderthal skull.
So it suggests we evolved a slightly different way of building our brains, maybe leading to different cognitive wiring.
That's the hypothesis, a different developmental pathway resulting in a different kind of brain, even if the raw intelligence wasn't vastly different day to day.
Okay, that makes sense. Then there's another really specific one highlighted, the ADSL gene. This one's involved in purine synthesis.
Yeah, ADSL is crucial. Purines are building blocks for DNA and RNA, and also involved in cellular energy, ATP. So pretty fundamental stuff.
And the difference between our version and the Neanderthal version is tiny.
Incredibly tiny. Just a single amino acid swapped out, we have a valine, where they, and other archaics, had an alanine at a specific position in the ADSL enzyme.
One single amino acid. And that change made our version less stable, less active. That sounds like a bad thing.
Counterintuitive, right? You'd think more stable, more active would be better, but that one change makes the modern human ADSL enzyme slightly less robust, slightly less efficient than the archaic version.
So how on earth could a less effective enzyme give us an advantage?
That's what researchers wanted to know. So they did a clever experiment. They genetically modified mice to carry the human-like ADSL variant.
Okay, humanized mice, basically.
Right, and then they tested them. And what they found was really interesting, particularly in the female mice. The ones with the human-like ADSL seemed to learn faster in certain tasks. And they were quicker to figure out how to get scarce resources in this specific test. It was access to water after a period of restriction.
Wow, so a tiny molecular tweak, making an enzyme slightly less stable, somehow translated into a subtle behavioral edge. Faster learning, better resourcefulness.
That seems to be the finding. It suggests that maybe this slightly detuned enzyme, perhaps affecting purine levels in the brain in some subtle way, gave us a slight cognitive or behavioral advantage.
Enough to matter in a competitive environment over millennia.
Potentially, yes. Again, it's about these small, cumulative advantages. A slight edge in learning, adapting, or competing for resources generation after generation could really add up. It's a beautiful example of how evolution works at the finest scale.
So we've got internal factors, mutation load, the piezo-1 trap, maybe subtle cognitive advantages from things like ADSL. But what about external threats? How did we cope with the environment compared to Neanderthals? There's a surprising twist here involving, of all things, lead.
Yeah, this one really challenges preconceptions. We tend to think of lead pollution as a modern industrial problem, right? Factories, leaded gasoline, paint.
Exactly, post-industrial revolution stuff.
Turns out, significant lead exposure might be a much, much older story for hominins. There was a fascinating study looking at fossil teeth.
Teeth. How do they show lead exposure?
Teeth grow in layers, a bit like tree rings. And heavy metals, if you're exposed to them while the tooth is forming, can get incorporated into those layers. So researchers analyzed teeth from a whole range of ancient hominins going back over 2 million years. Species like Australopithecus africanus, Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens from Africa, Asia, Europe. 51 teeth in total.
And what did they find?
The results were pretty startling. Over 70%, I think it was 73% of these ancient teeth show clear signs of episodic lead exposure, visible as distinct bands of lead laid down on the enamel or dentine.
73%. Where was all this lead coming from way back then?
Good question. The thinking is it likely wasn't industrial, obviously, but maybe from things like constantly burning wood fires in poorly ventilated caves, wood smoke contains lead, or perhaps from processing certain types of ores or pigments, even just handling lead-rich rocks. The point is, it seems lead was a more common environmental neurotoxin than we appreciated.
Okay, so if lead was a recurring environmental stressor for potentially millions of years, did Homo sapiens evolve a better way to deal with it than Neanderthals?
This is where another key genetic difference might come into play. A gene called NOVA1.
NVA1, what does that do?
It's a really important one. It's considered a master regulator gene, especially active during early brain development. It helps control how hundreds of other genes are expressed, essentially orchestrating how neurons grow, connect, and form synapses.
So, essential to building a functioning brain. And we have a different version than Neanderthals.
We do. And researchers came up with a brilliant way to test the functional difference. They used brain organoids.
Mini brains in a dish.
Basically, yeah. They grew one set of brain organoids using the modern human NOVA1 gene, and another set using the archaic version found in Neanderthals and Denisovans. Then they exposed both sets to lead.
Okay, mimicking that ancient environmental exposure, what happened?
The difference was quite striking. The organoids with the archaic Novier1 variant seemed much more vulnerable to the lead's toxic effects. The lead really messed with their development.
How so?
Critically, the lead exposure in the archaic organoids disrupted the normal expression levels of other important developmental genes. One that really stood out was FOXP2.
FOXP2. That rings a bell. Isn't that often linked to speech and language?
Exactly. It's not the language gene, but it's crucial for the fine motor control involved in speech and likely broader cognitive functions related to learning and communication. So the lead exposure, filtered through the archaic Novier1, was throwing a wrench into the works of genes vital for complex cognition and potentially language.
Wow, so the archaic brain structure was potentially more susceptible to being derailed by this common environmental toxin, compromising maybe learning, communication, social complexity.
That's the strong implication. But the organoids with the modern human Novier1 variant, they showed significantly more resilience.
They could handle the lead better.
They weren't immune, but the modern Novier1 offered relative protection. It buffered the developing neurons against that lead-induced stress much more effectively. It kept those downstream genes, like FOXP2, closer to their normal expression levels.
So the argument is that our version of Novier1 was actively selected for because it gave our kids' brains a better chance of developing normally, even when exposed to background levels of lead.
Precisely. It conferred neurological resilience. In an environment where lead exposure was apparently quite common, having that protective version of Novier1 would have provided a subtle but significant survival and developmental advantage generation after generation. Better brain development means better learning, communication, social cohesion, all crucial for thriving.
Okay, let's try and pull all these threads together. What does this complex picture actually mean for Neanderthal extinction? It sounds like there was no single knockout blow.
Definitely not. No single catastrophe, no simple outsmarting. It really looks like a slow, grinding process driven by a combination of factors, a confluence of disadvantages.
So you start with their demographic situation.
Right. Relatively small, fragmented populations, probably already carrying a higher genetic load of slightly detrimental mutations just due to their population structure, makes them inherently a bit less robust, a bit more vulnerable to shocks.
Then you add the hybridization problem.
Yeah, particularly that PISO1 maternal-fetal incompatibility. It acts like a constant low-level drag on reproductive success, specifically purging Neanderthal maternal lines over time. A silent reproductive trap.
And on top of that, potential differences in coping with the environment.
Like the Novier1 gene story, if modern humans had even slightly better neurological resilience to common environmental toxins like lead, that translates to healthier babies, more robust cognitive development, maybe better social learning and cohesion. Another small but persistent edge.
Plus, maybe subtle cognitive differences suggested by things like ADSL.
Possibly. It all adds up. It paints a picture of extinction through sustained, low-level biological erosion. A death by 1,000 tiny cuts rather than a swift execution.
And the demographic models, they really underscore how sensitive small populations are to this stuff, right? I saw a figure mentioned, a fertility decrease of just 2.7%.
Yeah, models suggest that even a tiny sustained decrease in the fertility of young Neanderthal females, something like 2.7%, if it persisted over a long time, would have been sufficient to drive their population size down below a recoverable threshold, leading to extinction over centuries or millennia.
It didn't take much, just a slight, relentless tipping of the scales.
Exactly. So the big takeaway isn't about Neanderthal inferiority or modern human superiority in some grand sense. It's about biological resilience, the subtle costs of hybridization in that specific context, and how small, cumulative genetic advantages interacting with the environment can shape the destiny of entire species over deep time.
It really shifts the focus from conflict to biology, from drama to demographics.
Precisely.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive thinking about this complex genetic exchange, it leaves us with a really interesting kind of provocative thought, doesn't it? We know hybridization sometimes gives the recipient species useful new tricks, like the high-altitude adaptation gene Tibetans apparently got from Denisovans.
Right, EPAS1, a classic example of adaptive introgression, borrowing useful genes from archaic relatives.
So while natural selection was working on those early human Neanderthal hybrids, it was busy weeding out the downsides, the higher mutation load, the PISO1 incompatibility, maybe other negative interactions.
Negative selection, yeah. Purging the stuff that reduced fitness.
But in that process of cleaning house, did we accidentally throw out some potentially useful Neanderthal genes along with the bad? Could there have been beneficial Neanderthal variations, maybe for immunity or metabolism or other traits, that got lost simply because they were genetically linked to detrimental genes in those early hybrids that didn't thrive?
That's a fascinating question. It's entirely possible. Selection acts on the whole package, the whole individual. If the overall fitness of early hybrids was lower due to these incompatibilities and mutation load, even beneficial archaic genes they carried might have been purged by association.
So, in gaining our specific modern human advantages and resilience, maybe we unknowingly lost other potentially valuable pieces of archaic genetic diversity forever.
It's a definite possibility. The story of human evolution is full of these trade-offs and genetic ghosts. What we gained, what we lost, it's all part of untangling our complex past. Makes you wonder what other secrets are still hidden in our genomes.